She woke up that morning believing her marriage was over. What she didn't know was that the secret her husband had been hiding for months wasn't what she thought. And the truth? It would shatter everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the man sleeping beside her. For 17 years, she had built a life with him. 2 children, a home filled with laughter, routines that felt like safety. But in the last 6 months, something had shifted. He came home late. He avoided her eyes. He kept his phone face down on the table, always. The distance between them grew wider each day, like a chasm opening slowly, silently, swallowing the intimacy they once shared. She felt it in her bones. The coldness, the evasion, the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder. Every fiber of her being screamed the same conclusion. He was cheating. It was the only explanation that made sense. The late nights at the office, the sudden business trips, the cologne she didn't recognize, the way he showered immediately when he got home, as if washing away evidence. She had seen this story before, heard it from friends, read it in articles. She knew the signs, and every sign pointed to betrayal. Stay with me, because what comes next may heal your heart or reveal truths you've buried deep inside. This isn't just her story. It's about the assumptions we make when fear takes over, when silence replaces conversation, and when love hangs by a thread we're too afraid to pull. One morning, after another sleepless night, she made a decision. She would confront him. She would demand the truth. She rehearsed the words in her mind 100 times. Who is she? How long has this been going on? Do you even love me anymore? Her hands trembled as she poured coffee, waiting for him to come downstairs. The children had already left for school. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When he finally appeared, looking exhausted and hollow, she couldn't hold it in any longer. The words tumbled out sharp and desperate. She accused him, she cried, she told him she knew. She said she wasn't stupid, that she had seen the signs, that he had been lying to her for months. And then he broke. Not with guilt, not with confession, but with something she hadn't expected. Tears. Raw, uncontrollable tears. He sank into the chair, his face in his hands, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were red, his voice cracked. He wasn't having an affair. He had never been with another woman. The secret he'd been keeping, the reason for the distance, the late nights, the exhaustion, was something entirely different, something that would change everything. He had been diagnosed with a serious illness 6 months ago, a tumor, operable but terrifying. He had been going through tests, consultations, late-night research, trying to understand his options, trying to figure out how to protect his family from the fear that consumed him every waking moment. He didn't tell her because he didn't want to burden her. He thought he could handle it alone, that he could shield her and the children from the weight of it, until he had answers, until he had a plan. He thought silence was strength. He thought protecting her meant keeping her in the dark. She stood there, frozen, as the truth washed over her like a tidal wave. All the anger, all the suspicion, all the certainty she had felt just moments before evaporated, replaced by a crushing guilt and a desperate, overwhelming love. She had been so sure, so convinced that she knew what was happening. But she had been wrong, completely, devastatingly wrong. She had let fear dictate her reality. She had created a narrative in her mind and believed it without question, without giving him the chance to explain, without trusting the man she had loved for nearly 2 decades. And now, standing in their kitchen, looking at the broken man before her, she realized how close she had come to destroying everything, how one more day, one more accusation, one more assumption could have shattered their marriage beyond repair, how fragile love becomes when communication dies, when trust is replaced by doubt, and when silence is mistaken for guilt. The weight of that moment settled between them, heavy and undeniable. She moved toward him, her own tears falling now, and wrapped her arms around him. She whispered apologies. She told him she loved him. She promised they would face whatever came next together. But even as she held him, even as relief and regret tangled in her chest, she couldn't shake the question that haunted her. How had they let it come to this? How had two people who once shared everything become strangers living under the same roof? And more importantly, how many other couples were making the same mistake right now, assuming the worst, letting silence breed mistrust, standing on the edge of losing everything because they were too afraid, too proud, or too hurt to simply ask the truth? This is where their story truly begins. Not with the confrontation, not with the revelation, but with what happened next. Because discovering the truth was only the first step. Healing the wounds they had inflicted on each other, rebuilding the trust they had nearly destroyed, and learning how to love each other through fear and vulnerability, that was the real journey. And it was a journey that would test them in ways they never imagined. It would force them to confront not just his illness, but the deeper fractures in their relationship, the patterns of communication they had fallen into, the assumptions they made, and the walls they had built without even realizing it. It would strip them bare, exposing every insecurity, every unspoken resentment, every moment they had chosen silence over honesty. But it would also show them something beautiful, something rare. That love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about showing up even when you're terrified. It's about choosing each other even when it's hard. It's about believing in the bond you've built, even when everything feels uncertain. In the days that followed, they began to talk, really talk. For the first time in months, maybe years, they sat down without distractions, without defenses, and spoke from the heart. He told her about the fear that had consumed him from the moment he heard the diagnosis. The terror of leaving his family behind, the guilt of feeling like he was failing them, the exhaustion of pretending everything was fine when inside, he was falling apart. She told him about the loneliness she had felt, the nights she lay awake wondering if she had lost him, the pain of feeling invisible in her own marriage. They both admitted they had made mistakes. He should have told her. She should have asked. They both should have trusted each other more. And slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks that felt like an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. In that time, everything changed. Not the circumstances, not the diagnosis, but the way they faced it. Together. She went with him to every appointment. She sat beside him in sterile waiting rooms, holding his hand, asking questions when his voice failed him. She researched his condition late into the night, reading medical journals and patient testimonials, trying to understand what they were up against. She became his advocate, his support, his anchor, and he let her. For the first time in months, he stopped trying to be strong alone. He let himself be vulnerable. He let himself lean on her. He let himself admit that he was terrified, that he didn't have all the answers, that he needed her. And in that vulnerability, something remarkable happened. They fell in love again. Not the easy, effortless love of their early years, but something deeper, more profound. A love forged in crisis, tempered by fear, strengthened by honesty. They remembered why they had chosen each other all those years ago. They rediscovered the friendship that had existed before the romance, the partnership that had sustained them through previous challenges. They laughed again, really laughed, finding humor in the absurdity of hospital gowns and medical jargon. They cried together, holding each other through the waves of fear that crashed over them in the middle of the night. They talked about everything, their dreams, their regrets, the life they wanted to build once this was over, the legacy they wanted to leave for their children. The children knew something was happening, of course. Children always know. They sensed the tension, the hushed conversations, the way their parents looked at each other with a mixture of fear and determination. So she and her husband sat them down one evening after dinner and told them the truth. Not all of it, not the terrifying statistics or the worst-case scenarios, but enough. Enough for them to understand that their father was sick, that he would need surgery, that there would be difficult days ahead, but that they would face it as a family. The children asked questions. The youngest cried. The oldest tried to be brave, holding back tears, asking what they could do to help. And in that moment, watching her family come together, watching her children rally around their father with a courage that broke her heart and filled it simultaneously, she realized something profound. This crisis, as devastating as it was, had given them a gift. It had stripped away all the superficiality, all the petty concerns, all the daily distractions that had been slowly eroding their connection. It had reminded them what truly mattered: each other, love, time, presence, the simple, extraordinary privilege of being together. The night before the surgery, they lay in bed together, neither of them able to sleep. She traced patterns on his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm, steady and strong. He played with her hair, the way he used to when they were young, when the world felt full of possibility and nothing could touch them. They didn't talk much. Words felt inadequate for what they were facing, but the silence between them was different now. Not the cold, distant silence of the previous months, but a warm, companionable silence. The silence of two people who had found their way back to each other. He whispered that he was sorry. Sorry for shutting her out. Sorry for making her doubt his love. Sorry for almost losing her because of his fear. She whispered back that she was sorry too. Sorry for not trusting him. Sorry for assuming the worst. Sorry for letting her insecurity overshadow their history. They forgave each other. And more importantly, they forgave themselves. The surgery lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of waiting. 7 hours of pacing hospital corridors. 7 hours of watching the clock, praying, hoping, bargaining with whatever force in the universe might be listening. She sat in the surgical waiting room surrounded by other families, all of them trapped in their own private hells, all of them wearing the same expression of exhausted hope. She thought about all the times she had taken for granted, the ordinary mornings, the mundane conversations, the casual touches. She promised herself that if they got through this, if he came out of that operating room whole and healthy, she would never take a single moment for granted again. She would tell him she loved him every day. She would ask him about his fears and his dreams. She would choose presence over distraction, connection over convenience. She would fight for their marriage the way he was fighting for his life right now, on that operating table with every fiber of his being. When the surgeon finally emerged, still in his scrubs, his expression carefully neutral, her heart stopped. She stood, her legs shaky, her mouth dry. The surgeon smiled, a small, tired smile. The surgery had been successful. They had removed the tumor. The margins were clear. He would need follow-up treatment, monitoring, lifestyle changes, but the prognosis was good. She collapsed back into the chair, her whole body shaking with relief, so intense it felt physical. She sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, releasing months of fear and tension and worry. The other families in the waiting room understood. Some smiled at her. Some cried with her. They were all part of the same club, the club nobody wants to join, the club of people who have stared into the abyss and lived to tell about it. Sharing these heartfelt stories isn't easy, but if you feel the weight of these hidden bonds, subscribe and join us. Your like can spread empathy, and your comment can share a story that touches another soul. Because these moments, these real, raw, human experiences, they connect us in ways that transcend distance and difference. They remind us that we're not alone in our struggles, our fears, our mistakes, that every person walking this earth is fighting battles we know nothing about, that kindness and understanding and compassion are not just virtues, but necessities, oxygen for the soul in a world that often feels suffocating. She was allowed to see him an hour later in the recovery room. He looked small and fragile, tubes and monitors surrounding him, his skin pale against the white hospital sheets. But he was alive, he was breathing. When he opened his eyes and saw her sitting beside him, he smiled. A weak, drowsy smile, but a smile nonetheless. She took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV, and pressed it to her cheek. She told him he did it. He made it through. They made it through. He squeezed her hand, too tired to speak, but she saw everything she needed to see in his eyes. Relief, love, gratitude, hope. The recovery was long and difficult. There were complications, infections, setbacks. Days when the pain was so intense he couldn't get out of bed. Days when the fear crept back in, whispering that maybe they weren't out of the woods after all. But they faced every challenge together. She learned to change dressings and monitor medications. She became an expert in post-surgical care, nutrition, physical therapy. She advocated fiercely when doctors weren't listening, pushed back when she knew something wasn't right. She became a warrior for him, a guardian, a protector, and he learned to receive, to accept help, to acknowledge weakness, to understand that strength is not about suffering in silence, but about having the courage to admit when you can't do it alone. He learned to express his feelings, to voice his fears, to ask for what he needed. He learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the foundation of true intimacy. Together, they learned that marriage isn't a destination, but a journey. It's not about avoiding conflict, but about learning how to fight fair and love harder. It's not about being perfect, but about being present. It's not about never making mistakes, but about having the humility to admit when you're wrong and the grace to forgive when you're hurt. They learned that the biggest threat to their marriage hadn't been his illness or her suspicion, but the silence that had grown between them, the assumptions they had made without verification, the stories they had told themselves instead of asking for the truth. Months passed. His strength returned gradually. He went back to work part-time at first, then full-time. The scars healed, though some would remain forever, thin white lines on his skin that told the story of survival. They established new routines, morning walks together before the children woke up, weekly date nights, no matter how tired they were, daily check-ins, honest conversations about how they were feeling, what they needed, what they were struggling with. They went to counseling, both together and individually, working through the trauma of the experience, the patterns that had nearly destroyed them, the tools they needed to build a healthier future. They learned communication techniques, active listening, non-defensive responding, how to express needs without accusation, how to offer support without fixing, how to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. A year after the surgery, they took a trip, just the two of them, their first real vacation alone in over a decade. They drove to the coast, rented a small cottage overlooking the ocean, and spent 5 days doing nothing but being together. Walking on the beach at sunrise, cooking simple meals, reading books side by side, making love with a tenderness and intensity that came from knowing how close they had come to losing each other, talking for hours about everything and nothing. On the last night, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill. He turned to her and said something she would never forget. He said that the tumor, as terrible as it had also been a gift. It had forced them to stop, to look at their lives, to question what they had been doing, where they had been going, who they had become. It had stripped away all the noise and left them with what truly mattered: each other, their family, their love. Without it, they might have continued drifting apart, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day they woke up as strangers who happened to share a last name and a mortgage. The tumor had been the wake-up call they didn't know they needed. She understood what he meant, though it was a hard truth to accept. Nobody wants to be grateful for a life-threatening illness. Nobody wants to acknowledge that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are also the catalysts for the most profound growth. But it was true. The crisis had broken them open, exposing all the cracks and weaknesses in their relationship, forcing them to either fix them or watch everything crumble. They had chosen to fix them, and in doing so they had built something stronger, more resilient, more real than what they had before. She told him about that morning, the morning she had confronted him, convinced he was cheating. She told him about the narrative she had constructed in her mind, the evidence she had compiled, the certainty she had felt. She told him how ashamed she felt now, looking back, knowing how wrong she had been, how her fear and insecurity had nearly destroyed the most important relationship in her life, how she had been so focused on what she thought was happening that she had completely missed what was actually happening. He listened without judgment. He told her he understood, that in some ways her assumption made sense, that his behavior had been suspicious, secretive, distant, that he had given her every reason to doubt, that the fault wasn't hers alone, but theirs together, a shared failure of communication and trust. They talked about the patterns they had fallen into over the years, the ways they had stopped prioritizing each other, how the demands of work and children and daily life had slowly pushed their relationship to the background, how they had started treating each other like roommates instead of lovers, partners instead of soulmates, how they had stopped asking the important questions and started making assumptions instead, how easy it is to lose each other when you stop paying attention, when you stop being curious, when you stop choosing each other every single day. They made promises to each other that night, promises about the future they wanted to build, about staying present, about continuing to communicate, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, about never letting silence become a substitute for honesty, about checking their assumptions and asking questions instead of jumping to conclusions, about protecting their relationship with the same fierceness they protected their children, about remembering that marriage is not a static state, but a living, breathing entity that requires constant care and attention and nourishment. When they returned home, they made changes, real, tangible changes. They rearranged their priorities. He turned down a promotion that would have required more travel and longer hours. She started saying no to commitments that drained her energy and left nothing for her family. They established boundaries around work and technology, no phones at the dinner table, no checking emails after 8 p.m., one weekend a month dedicated entirely to family, no exceptions. They created rituals, morning coffee together before the chaos of the day began, evening walks after dinner, Sunday mornings in bed, talking and laughing and reconnecting, monthly overnight stays at a local hotel, just the two of them, keeping the romance alive. They invested in their friendship. They started watching movies together again, discussing books, sharing music, rediscovering the interests and passions that had drawn them together in the beginning. They played board games. They cooked elaborate meals. They took dance lessons. They laughed. God, they laughed. Deep, belly-shaking laughter that felt like medicine for the soul. The children noticed the change. Their home felt different, lighter, warmer. There was less tension, less unspoken stress hovering in the air. Their parents smiled more, touched more, seemed more present, more engaged, more alive. The oldest asked about it one day, tentatively, afraid to jinx whatever magic had transformed their family. Her mother sat down with her and explained, in terms a teenager could understand, that sometimes people lose their way. They get caught up in the daily grind and forget to take care of the relationships that matter most. But if they're lucky, they get a second chance. They get a wake-up call that reminds them what's important. And if they're wise, they use that wake-up call to make changes, to do better, to be better. Her daughter listened carefully, then asked the question that had been weighing on her. Was Dad going to be okay? Was the cancer gone forever? Her mother took a deep breath. She explained that there were no guarantees in life, that her father would need regular checkups for years, maybe forever, that there was always a chance of recurrence, but that they chose to live in hope rather than fear, that they chose to focus on today, on this moment, on the gift of being together right now, rather than worrying about a future they couldn't control. This perspective, this shift from fear to gratitude, from anxiety to presence, became their new way of living. It wasn't always easy. There were still hard days, days when the fear crept back in, when a routine scan would send them spiraling into worry, when old patterns would resurface and they would catch themselves falling into silence instead of communication. But now they had tools. They had awareness. They knew what they were fighting for and what they were fighting against. They knew that their marriage was worth the effort, worth the vulnerability, worth the constant, conscious choice to show up for each other. They knew that love wasn't a feeling but an action, a decision they made every single day, sometimes moment by moment. If you've ever felt the pain of almost losing someone you love, of making assumptions that nearly destroyed everything, of finding your way back from the edge, subscribe and be part of this community. Share your thoughts in the comments because your story matters too. Your experience, your wisdom, your journey could be the light someone else needs in their darkness. We're all walking each other home, as the saying goes. We're all struggling and surviving, and searching for connection in a world that often feels isolating and overwhelming. These stories, these raw, honest testimonies of human experience, they're how we find each other, how we realize we're not alone, how we give each other permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to fall down and get back up again. Their story spread, quietly at first, then more widely. Friends noticed the change in them, the way they looked at each other, the way they moved through the world as a united front. People started asking questions. What happened? How did you do it? Can you help us? because so many couples were struggling with the same things: the distance, the silence, the assumptions, the slow erosion of intimacy, the feeling of being lonely inside a marriage, the suspicion that something was wrong but not knowing how to fix it. She started meeting with friends, sharing their story, offering the insights they had gained through their crisis and recovery. She wasn't a therapist or a counselor, just someone who had been to the edge and come back with a map. She talked about the importance of communication, about checking assumptions, about asking questions instead of making accusations, about vulnerability as strength, about the courage it takes to admit you're wrong, about the grace it takes to forgive, about the daily work of choosing love even when it's hard. One woman, a close friend, confided that she was convinced her husband was having an affair. The signs were all there: the distance, the secrecy, the late nights, the emotional withdrawal. She was planning to confront him, to demand a divorce, to blow up their lives based on her certainty that she knew what was happening. She listened to her friend with a sinking feeling of recognition. She heard her own voice from a year ago, so sure, so convinced, so wrong. She gently suggested that maybe, just maybe, there could be another explanation, that before making accusations, before assuming the worst, maybe her friend could try a different approach, create a safe space, express concern without blame, ask open-ended questions, give her husband the opportunity to share what was really going on. Her friend was skeptical but desperate enough to try. A week later she called, sobbing, not with anger or betrayal, but with relief and guilt and overwhelming compassion. Her husband wasn't having an affair. He was struggling with severe depression. He had been barely holding it together, ashamed to admit he was struggling, terrified of being seen as weak, drowning in darkness and unable to ask for help. The distance, the withdrawal, the secrecy, it was all symptoms of his mental health crisis, not evidence of infidelity. They were now in therapy together, individually and as a couple, working through it, fighting for their marriage and his well-being. And it all started because someone had shared their story, because someone had offered a different perspective, because someone had suggested that maybe, just maybe, things weren't what they seemed. 2 years after the surgery, he went for his routine scan. The scan that had become both a blessing and a curse, a necessary checkpoint that brought relief and anxiety in equal measure. They had been through this ritual many times now. The waiting, the hoping, the fear that lived just beneath the surface of their daily lives, quiet but never quite gone. She went with him, as she always did. They held hands in the waiting room. They made small talk with the technician. They tried to stay calm, to breathe, to trust. The results came back 3 days later, clear. No sign of recurrence, no new growths, no concerning shadows, just clean, beautiful, miraculous clarity. They celebrated that night with champagne and tears, calling their children, their parents, their closest friends, sharing the good news, marking another milestone in their journey. Another chapter survived, another reason to be grateful. But more than the medical victory, they celebrated what they had built together, the marriage they had saved, the love they had deepened, the family they had strengthened, the life they had chosen consciously and deliberately in the face of mortality and fear. That night, lying in bed, they reflected on everything that had happened, the misunderstanding that had nearly ended them, the illness that had nearly taken him, the hard work of rebuilding trust and communication, the transformation they had undergone, both individually and together. He said something that struck her deeply. He said that most people never get the chance to see what really matters until it's too late. They spend their whole lives chasing things that don't matter, neglecting things that do, sleepwalking through their relationships until suddenly it's over and they're standing at a funeral or signing divorce papers wondering what happened. But they had been given a gift, a terrible, beautiful gift, the gift of perspective, the gift of clarity, the gift of a second chance. And they had taken that gift and used it to build something extraordinary. Not a perfect marriage, because perfect doesn't exist, but a real one, an honest one, a resilient one. A marriage built on truth and vulnerability and daily choice. She thought about all the marriages around them that were crumbling, friends who were divorcing, colleagues who were cheating, neighbors who were living as strangers under the same roof. She thought about how many of those relationships could be saved if people would just talk to each other. Really talk. Without blame. Without defensiveness. With genuine curiosity and compassion. She thought about how many marriages end not because of big dramatic betrayals, but because of slow erosion, the accumulation of tiny disconnections, the daily choices to turn away instead of toward each other, the assumptions that replace communication, the silence that replaces intimacy. She thought about how preventable it all was, how unnecessary, if people would just pay attention, if they would prioritize their relationships with the same intensity they brought to their careers and hobbies and social media presence. She started writing, at first just for herself in a journal, processing her thoughts and feelings and insights. But then she started sharing her writing online, blog posts, social media reflections, stories about their journey, the lessons they had learned, the mistakes they had made, the hope they wanted to offer others. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, expressing gratitude for her honesty, telling her that her words had saved their marriage, had given them courage to have difficult conversations, had helped them see their partner through new eyes. She was humbled and honored and slightly terrified by the responsibility. She wasn't an expert. She was just someone who had almost lost everything and fought like hell to get it back. But maybe that was enough. Maybe the world didn't need more experts. Maybe it needed more honest voices willing to admit their failures and share their victories, willing to be vulnerable in a culture that prizes perfection, willing to say, yes, I almost destroyed my marriage because I assumed the worst instead of asking for the truth. And here's what I learned. Her husband supported her fully. He gave her permission to share their story, understanding that their private pain could become public healing. He started joining her in some of the conversations, offering the male perspective, talking about the isolation he had felt, the cultural messages that told him to be strong and silent, to shoulder burdens alone, to never show weakness, the toxic masculinity that had nearly killed him, both literally and figuratively, the freedom he had found in vulnerability, the strength he had discovered in admitting need, the intimacy that had blossomed when he finally let his walls down. Together they became advocates for honest communication in marriage, for mental health awareness, for challenging the cultural narratives that keep people isolated and struggling in silence, for creating spaces where vulnerability is celebrated rather than punished, for normalizing the hard work of relationships, for admitting that marriage is not a fairy tale but a daily choice, sometimes a difficult one, always a worthwhile one. Their children grew older, watching their parents model a different kind of love, a mature love, a tested love, a love that had survived crisis and emerged stronger. The oldest, now in college, came home one weekend with relationship troubles of her own. Her boyfriend had been distant. She was convinced he was losing interest, maybe seeing someone else. She was planning to confront him, to end it before he could hurt her more. Her mother listened, hearing echoes of her own past, and gently shared her story. The whole story, the assumption, the confrontation, the truth she had missed, the damage she had nearly caused. She told her daughter that sometimes distance isn't about disinterest, but about struggle. That people withdraw when they're hurting, when they're scared, when they don't know how to ask for help. That before assuming the worst, it's worth asking questions with genuine curiosity and creating safe space for honest answers. Her daughter listened, skeptical but willing to try. She had the conversation. It turned out her boyfriend was struggling with anxiety about his future, pressure from his family, fear about his career path, nothing to do with her or their relationship. He had been pulling away because he felt overwhelmed, not because he cared less. They worked through it together, and her daughter called home to say thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for teaching me to ask instead of assume. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like. This is the ripple effect of truth-telling, of vulnerability, of sharing our stories. One conversation becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes 100. One saved marriage inspires another. One moment of courage creates permission for someone else's courage. We are all connected, our stories woven together in ways we rarely see. Your pain might be someone else's teacher. Your victory might be someone else's hope. Your honesty might be someone else's permission to be honest too. This is why these stories matter. Why telling them, despite the discomfort and vulnerability, is an act of service. Why your story, the one you're carrying right now, deserves to be told. 5 years after that terrible morning when she woke up believing her marriage was over, they renewed their vows. Not in a big ceremony, but in a small, intimate gathering of their closest family and friends. They wrote their own vows, honest and raw and beautiful. They promised to keep choosing each other, to keep communicating even when it's hard, to check their assumptions and ask their questions, to never let silence replace honesty, to face whatever comes next together, hand in hand, heart to heart. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, because everyone there knew the journey they had been on, the darkness they had walked through, the miracle of their survival and transformation. As they exchanged rings and kissed, their children watching with tears and smiles, she felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly knocked her over. Gratitude for the second chance they had been given. Gratitude for the hard lessons learned. Gratitude for the man standing beside her, still here, still fighting, still loving. Gratitude for the life they had built from the ashes of what almost was. Their story doesn't end here. It continues, as all stories do, with new chapters and new challenges and new opportunities for growth. But they face it differently now, with tools and awareness and commitment, with communication and vulnerability and grace, with the hard-won knowledge that assumptions are dangerous, that silence is deadly, that love requires constant tending, and that the truth, however difficult, is always better than the stories we tell ourselves in its absence. They know now that marriage is not about avoiding storms, but about learning to dance in the rain. It's not about being perfect, but about being present. It's not about never making mistakes, but about making amends when you do. It's about showing up day after day, year after year, choosing each other, fighting for each other, believing in each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. This was the journey of one soul, of two souls intertwined, but so many others are waiting to be told. If you've ever felt the pain of lost connections or the joy of reunion, join our community. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe, just maybe, your own story. Together we celebrate the essence of life and the bonds that unite us. Because we need these stories. We need to know that we're not alone in our struggles. We need to see examples of people who fell down and got back up. We need permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to almost destroy everything and still find redemption. We need hope, and hope lives in stories, in the honest, vulnerable, beautiful mess of human experience, in the triumph of love over fear, in the courage it takes to ask for truth instead of assuming the worst, in the miracle of second chances and the wisdom to use them well. Your like spreads this message of hope. Your comment adds to the collective wisdom. Your subscription supports the creation of more content that reminds us all of our shared humanity. So join us. Be part of this movement toward greater honesty, deeper connection, more authentic love. Because your story matters, your experience matters, your voice matters. And together, we can create a world where marriages are saved, where communication replaces assumption, where love wins, one honest conversation at a time.